On that chilly morning in Salem Heights, the park seemed asleep, lulled only by the creaking of ancient trees swaying in the wind. In the center of the square stood the old stone well, covered in moss and surrounded by stories time seemed to have forgotten. To most, it was nothing more than an ancient, unimportant landmark. But to Ethan Johnson, a boy of just 11, the well was a living threat, a silent enemy that seemed to pulse whenever his eyes met the dark rim of that opening. Ethan didn't need to speak for everyone to sense the weight of what he felt. He only had to approach the well, and suddenly his entire body would transform. His eyes widened, his breath shallowed, his hands trembled, and then the scream, a desperate sound that seemed to come not just from a child's throat, but from somewhere deeper, as if carrying echoes trapped deep within the earth. The sound chilled the spines of anyone nearby, paralyzed conversations, and filled the air with an inexplicable fear. And it wasn't an isolated incident. The scene repeated itself without fail whenever Ethan passed by. It could be morning or night, with or without people watching. The boy always pointed to the same spot on the edge, as if to reveal something invisible to the others. The locals whispered, some said it was just a child's imagination, others believed the well held an ancient curse. But no one dared descend to the bottom to discover the truth. With each new scream, the conviction grew that something was trapped down there, something waiting for the right moment to emerge. But after all, what could justify such horror in a child's eyes? If this introduction caught your attention, subscribe to the channel and leave a like to follow the next exciting stories. Salem Heights has always been described as a tranquil town, the kind that seems untouched by time. Its narrow streets, lined with well-preserved Victorian houses, conveyed an impression of stability and security. The Central Park, where the old well stood, was a gathering place for families on sunny weekends, with children playing on the swings, while elderly people chatted on wooden benches. But behind this welcoming exterior lay a disturbing, often overlooked detail. The well, built in the 19th century, remained there like a ghost rooted in the earth, a vestige of the past that no one dared to destroy, but also no one dared to restore. Adults saw the well as nothing more than a worthless piece of rock, something that should have been sealed decades ago. Whenever parents and teachers heard about Ethan's reactions, they were quick to downplay it. It's just a child's imagination, some said. He must have seen a horror movie, others explained. The problem was that the more they ignored the signs, the louder the boy's screams grew, and with them, the neighbors' unease. Sergeant Miller, a veteran city police officer, intervened during one of Ethan's public outbursts. Holding the boy by the shoulders, he tried to calm him down while whispering that there was nothing wrong with that old hole. But the child's terrified expression wouldn't subside, and the echo of his cries continued to reverberate even after everyone had left. Still, Miller reported that it was just childish theatrics. Older residents, however, recalled unconfirmed stories about people who had disappeared in the area decades ago. There were rumors that the well hid buried secrets, but, like any small town, rumors were swallowed by the silence of time. It was easier to believe these were just local legends than to face the possibility of a bloody past lurking in the place. Despite this, something began to change in collective behavior. Some mothers began to avoid taking their children to the park, claiming they didn't want to expose them to Ethan's attacks. Business owners complained about the discomfort caused by his constant shouting, which drove away customers. The school also began treating the incident as a disciplinary matter, threatening to reprimand the boy for disturbing the peace. As the town tried to silence Ethan, his screams echoed ever louder in the consciousness of those who witnessed it. There was something impossible to ignore in his pain, as if it were a key slowly unlocking a secret that had been suppressed for decades, and the more the adults tried to explain it rationally, the more evident the strangeness of the situation became. The well, still and silent, seemed to mock the collective blindness. For Ethan, each time his eyes fixed on the darkness of that opening, it wasn't just fear that manifested itself, but a kind of recognition, as if somehow he knew that whatever lay down there didn't want to remain forgotten. And this feeling, which was beginning to haunt not only the boy, but the entire town, would soon be confirmed by signs no one could ignore. Small details would emerge in everyday life, disturbing the most attentive, arousing suspicion in even the most skeptical. It was only the beginning of what would transform Salem Heights forever. The following days in Salem Heights were marked by a disturbing pattern. Ethan not only continued to scream whenever he passed the well, but he also began exhibiting other behaviors that puzzled those who knew him. Each night his mother would find his school notebooks filled with repetitive drawings, rectangular boxes, chains wrapped around objects, and dark shapes that resembled outstretched hands. Always the same line, always the same insistence. At first, they thought it was just another way to vent their fear, but they soon realized there was more to it. The drawings were made at specific times, almost always after Ethan had passed through the park and faced the well. It was as if the vision compelled him to record what he saw, like an uncontrollable reflex. At school, his behavior also drew attention. During class, Ethan became easily distracted, staring into space and muttering incoherent words that startled his classmates. One phrase in particular became a frequent refrain: "He's still there." Teachers tried to cover it up, saying that these were common fantasies of their age, but the students began to avoid him, afraid of what they didn't understand. His mother, increasingly concerned, sought help from a local psychologist who diagnosed the boy with unspecified trauma. But even therapy sessions didn't seem to curb the intensity of his outbursts. Ethan would come home with a blank stare, and in the middle of the night, he would wake up screaming, as if he'd heard someone calling his name from the bottom of the well. The situation began to spread throughout the community. Some neighbors, more superstitious, said the child had a sensitive gift, able to perceive what others couldn't. Others, more rational, argued that it was nothing more than a psychological disorder. But no one could ignore the precision with which he reacted, always in the same spot, always faced with the same dark silence. One episode in particular left an even greater mark on the town. One Sunday during Mass at the small Salem Heights church, Ethan suddenly stood up and began to cry convulsively. Between sobs, he pointed to the side window where the well tower could be seen in the distance. His voice echoed throughout the church. "He's asking to leave." The service was interrupted, and the collective discomfort increased even more. Rumors spread on every corner. Families discussed the matter in secret. Children repeated Ethan's phrases as if they were part of a growing urban legend. But behind the whispers, a silent fear grew. If the boy wasn't just imagining it, what really lurked at the bottom of that well? With each passing day, Ethan's reactions grew more intense, almost as if something were pressing him to reveal a truth no one wanted to face. And little by little, strange signs began to emerge in his surroundings, reinforcing the feeling that the boy's obsession was well-founded. And it was precisely in these seemingly insignificant details that Salem Heights would begin to realize that the threat wasn't just in the mind of a child. The well, in its profound silence, would begin to show signs that it held something much greater than anyone imagined. As the weeks passed, Salem Heights began to feel a subtle but deeply unsettling change. The old well, once a forgotten part of the town, seemed to take on a life of its own in the eyes of the residents. The first sign came almost imperceptibly, a strange, heavy odor, like rotting wood mixed with rust, that would suddenly arise when the wind changed direction. To some, it was simply the result of accumulated moisture at the bottom. To others, it seemed closer to the smell of something that should never have been left behind. The children were the first to notice that animals were avoiding the area. Dogs barked desperately whenever they were brought near the park, refusing to come any closer. Cats, usually curious, bristled and ran in the opposite direction, as if sensing something invisible. Even the birds, which previously flew overhead in noisy flocks, began to skirt the square, leaving the space around the well in an almost unnatural silence. At night, nearby residents swore they heard metallic sounds coming from below. Some described it as dragging chains, others as rhythmic knocking, as if someone were trying to get attention. No one dared to confirm it. And when questioned, local police officers offered simple explanations, claiming they were merely echoes from the old structure. But the discomfort only grew. Inside the houses, rumors began to circulate. Dishes breaking on their own, light bulbs flickering for no reason, doors opening with non-existent drafts, always accompanied by the feeling that something was watching behind every shadow. Ethan's name was always mentioned in these accounts, as if the boy had become the spokesperson for a truth the entire town feared to admit. The most disturbing moment came one stormy night. Thunder illuminated the park for a few seconds, and a woman watching from her kitchen window claimed to have seen a figure hunched over the edge of the well. She couldn't tell if it was a man or something else, but she was absolutely certain it wasn't just a reflection of the storm. After that night, rumors of ghosts multiplied, and the central square began to be avoided even during the day. Still, some tried to rationalize. For the more skeptical, everyone was simply being influenced by Ethan's crises. But within every suspicious look, there was the certainty that something was indeed wrong. The town, once tranquil, now walked under a blanket of growing tension, as if everyone awaited an inevitable revelation. And when the signs became so clear they could no longer be ignored, even the most skeptical began to realize that the well's silence hid more than ancient stories. Something was about to be exposed, and no one was sure they had the courage to face what they would find when they looked inside. Because if until then they were just scattered signs, they would soon converge into an event that would change the routine of Salem Heights and transform suspicions into dark certainties. The tension in Salem Heights could no longer be contained. Conversations at the market, at the school, and even in the hallways of the small church always converged on the same point: the old well. The discomfort was so great that the city was pressured to take action, even if only to calm the population. And so they summoned Sergeant Miller, a trusted man in the city, to conduct an official inspection. Miller wasn't just any cop. He was used to dealing with petty local crimes, arguments between neighbors, and the occasional theft. To him, all this commotion was nothing more than mass hysteria fueled by the outbursts of an oversensitive boy. Wearing his weather-beaten uniform, he walked to the park on a cloudy afternoon. Under the watchful eyes of residents who gathered around, eager for answers. With a flashlight in hand and a rope tied around his waist, he leaned over the edge of the well. The cold wind rose from the bottom like a sigh, bringing with it that unpleasant odor that had become familiar to the city. Miller frowned, but showed no fear. He descended a few meters, leaning against the ancient stones, and shone the beam inside. What he saw was nothing more than damp walls, infiltrated roots, and a muddy bottom. Nothing to justify the boy's screams. He climbed back up with a wry smile and announced to the crowd, "There's nothing here, just darkness and dampness. The rest is your imagination." The comment brought a forced relief to some, but Ethan's gaze, fixed and desperate, captured everyone's attention. The boy, watching from afar, began to cry silently, as if knowing the sergeant hadn't seen what should have been there. That night, Miller was awakened by a strange noise in his own home. He swore he heard chains dragging across the floor. When he turned on the light, he found nothing, but the smell of the well seemed to permeate the hallways. Even so, he convinced himself it was just a figment of his imagination. He didn't tell anyone. Meanwhile, Ethan had one of the biggest meltdowns of his life. He woke up screaming, claiming that they were furious because no one listened to them. His desperate mother could barely contain him, and the neighbors began to wonder if the boy was, in fact, connected to something beyond logic. The attempted investigation, rather than calming tensions, only reinforced the feeling that something was wrong. The authorities' silence contrasted with the community's growing panic. What if what was hidden couldn't be seen with the naked eye? What if the answers lay beyond the reach of any flashlight? These questions crept into the minds of residents, and for the first time, even the most skeptical began to wonder if they were facing something much bigger. Denial no longer sustained the city's security, and as if to prove it wouldn't be ignored, the next development would be so clear, so impossible to deny, that it would shatter any resistance. Something would come to light, leaving Salem Heights with no choice but to plunge headlong into the mystery of the old well. The days after Sergeant Miller's inspection brought an uneasy silence to Salem Heights. Many tried to convince themselves that there was nothing in the old well, repeating the officer's words like a comforting mantra. But this tranquility was only apparent, for Ethan would not be silent. His screams, more frequent and painful, began to echo throughout the town like an open wound no one knew how to close. The decisive event occurred on a Saturday afternoon when the school organized a community walk through the park. Entire families were present, children ran and played, and for a brief moment, Salem Heights seemed to return to normal. Until Ethan, walking hand in hand with his mother, suddenly stopped in front of the well. His eyes widened, his breath became shallow, and then a piercing scream rent the air, silencing the entire square. But this time, it wasn't just a scream. Ethan threw himself to the ground, writhing as if pulled by an invisible force. Between sobs, he raised his trembling arm and pointed directly at the well. His childish voice, thick with despair, rang out clearly and frighteningly. "If they don't take it out, someone's going to die. They're waiting. They want to get out." The shock was immediate. Parents hugged their children, teachers recoiled in terror, and even the most skeptical felt the weight of the boy's words. Sergeant Miller, who was also present, paled when he saw that this could no longer be dismissed as mere hysteria. Ethan's desperation wasn't an act, it was a warning. After this episode, no one could feign normalcy. Conversations in bars, churches, and even city hall meetings became charged with anxiety. For the first time, local leaders admitted that a more serious investigation might be necessary. The figure of the well ceased to be merely an uncomfortable legend and began to be seen as a real risk to the city. That same night, older residents recalled forgotten events, unexplained disappearances, hushed rumors, stories of families who had suddenly left Salem Heights. Everything seemed to fit together, like pieces of a puzzle the town refused to put together. And now, through the eyes and pain of a child, the secrets were resurfacing. Ethan, exhausted from his outburst, fell into a deep sleep. But before falling asleep, he murmured a phrase that made his mother shudder. "They are tired of waiting." These words echoed through the community like an echo no one could ignore. It was as if a deadline had been set, as if something was about to break. There was no longer any room for doubt. Salem Heights had to act. The decision was made quickly. A formal investigation would be conducted with ropes, boxes, and the involvement of the police. What had previously been avoided at all costs now became inevitable. The well would no longer be a shadow in the town's memory and would be seen as the gateway to a secret that could no longer remain closed. But what really awaited in the depths of that darkness, the answer would soon come. And when it did, no one in Salem Heights would ever be the same again. The decision to investigate the old well fell upon Salem Heights like an inevitable. Wait, there was no escape. After Ethan's public meltdown, even the most skeptical succumbed to collective fear. The city authorized a police presence, and within days, the Central Park was surrounded by curious onlookers who crowded together to witness what promised to be one of the most defining moments in the city's history. Sergeant Miller returned, this time accompanied by two younger officers. They carried thick ropes, powerful flashlights, and an iron box secured by chains, designed to lower them to the bottom. The objective was simple: explore deeply, bring back any suspicious objects, and finally put an end to the rumors once and for all. But as the equipment was assembled, the tension only grew. The air seemed thicker around the well, and the metallic smell became stronger than ever. Ethan was present, clinging to his mother's arm. Unlike other days, he didn't scream. His eyes, however, were fixed on the dark opening, as if observing every detail with a consciousness the others lacked. When the box was positioned on the edge, the boy simply whispered, "He will return." The words chilled even the police officers, who tried to ignore the comment to maintain a firm stance. The operation began. Slowly, the box was lowered into the shaft, creaking against the damp walls and disappearing into the darkness. The silence among those present was absolute, interrupted only by the sound of the iron dragging and the rope sliding. All eyes were glued to that movement, as if every inch revealed the proximity of a forgotten truth. After minutes that felt like hours, the officers began to pull the box back up. The effort was evident. It felt heavier than when it had been lowered. The men's arms trembled, and the rope strained as if something were resisting them down below. Murmurs spread among the onlookers, and many wondered in hushed tones if it wouldn't be better to stop. But it was too late. The box slowly surfaced, dripping with dark, muddy water. The chains clinked almost mournfully, and when it finally reached the surface, a collective shudder ran through the crowd. Inside were pieces of broken wood, fragments of sodden fabric, and something no one expected: a rectangular volume covered in slime and partially wrapped in decaying leather. Sergeant Miller carefully removed the object. It was an old diary, its damp pages stuck together, exuding the same odor that once plagued the city. Ethan, seeing it, let out a low groan, as if he recognized the object without ever having seen it. The crowd backed away apprehensively, waiting for someone to dare open it. The silence around the well became unbearable. It was as if the entire park had held its breath. The diary was more than just a find. It represented proof that something was indeed buried near that spot. The question now was no longer whether something was wrong, but what exactly was about to be revealed. And when they finally decided to turn those pages, Salem Heights would plunge into a nightmare that would turn legends into dark truths. The diary found inside the box immediately became the center of attention. Sergeant Miller, still skeptical, tried to maintain a posture of authority, but even he couldn't hide his discomfort holding the sodden, heavy object. The pages, stuck together by moisture, creaked as they were forced open. The deteriorated leather bore cut marks, as if someone had tried to erase or seal his story forever. The first detail that caught the attention of those present. Right on the cover, there was a name, almost illegible, handwritten, but still recognizable under the dirt. It was from Samuel Whitaker, a man mentioned in old street conversations, disappeared decades ago without a trace. Many of the older generation remembered hearing about him, but always as part of confusing rumors. No one had ever officially confirmed his existence. Opening the first few pages, what emerged was more disturbing than any legend. There were old photographs, already yellowed and stained by water, showing the faces of smiling children, some of them in front of the same park where the well was located. Dates scrawled next to the images indicated a pattern, different years, but all concentrated in the same dark period in the city's history. Between the photos, notes scrawled in hurried handwriting recounted nocturnal encounters, secret meetings, and direct references to the well. Phrases like, "They can never leave," and "The key is locked up tight," appeared repeatedly, reinforcing the feeling that something had been deliberately imprisoned there. The previously curious residents began to back away, fearful of becoming embroiled in something that might be bigger than all of them combined. Ethan, who had been silent until then, approached slowly. His eyes never left the pages, and when the sergeant turned to a page with a drawing of a chained box, the boy simply murmured, "That's it. That's what I see every night." The crowd's reaction was immediate. Some put their hands to their mouths in shock, others backed away in panic, as if the boy's confirmation were an irrefutable sentence. The diary, in addition to accounts and photos, also contained rudimentary maps of the city, highlighting locations that no longer existed or had been modified over time. But in all of them, the central point was the same: the old well. That spot seemed to have been the nucleus of something obscure, a carefully buried secret that suddenly surfaced. Through a seemingly fragile object, Miller, despite his discomfort, decided to take the diary to the police station for further analysis. But before he could even put it in a box, Ethan grabbed his hand tightly and said, in a firm voice for the first time, "If he leaves here, they will be even angrier." The boy's warning left everyone silent. There was no way to know if it was intuition, a hunch, or a truth beyond logic. But no one could shake the weight of his words from their minds. And so, what began as a simple investigation turned into a deep dive into a conspiracy buried in time. The diary was just the first piece of a dark puzzle that promised to reveal far more than the town was prepared to hear. And when the following pages were analyzed, Salem Heights would discover something that would forever mark its history. At the Salem Heights police station, Samuel Whitaker's diary lay carefully on a metal table, still damp and exuding that dead, musty odor. Sergeant Miller and two investigators leafed through it with gloves, trying to preserve the fragile pages. With each turn, the room seemed plunged into an invisible darkness, as if the city itself were shrinking before what was about to be exposed. The first notes were already unsettling, but the following pages revealed a horror no one could have imagined. Samuel described secret meetings held decades ago by respected members of the community, pastors, teachers, influential businessmen. The tone of his writing alternated between tormented confessions and almost clinical accounts of macabre rituals that always took place at night, with the well as the central setting. The most disturbing passage came when he spoke of the children. According to the diary, young people were lured with promises of games, sweets, and gifts, but never returned home. The well, then, was not just a forgotten structure. It was a mass grave, a place where innocent lives had been silenced in the name of secrets the town never wanted to face. On one of the pages, still glued with traces of dried blood, was a list of names. Many were familiar to the elders, sons and daughters of families who had officially moved from Salem Heights in search of opportunity. Now, the truth emerged in desperate scribbles. They had never left. They were at rock bottom. When the revelation was shared with some residents, the shock was devastating. People fainted, others burst into tears, remembering their own missing relatives. It was as if an old wound had been violently reopened, bringing to the surface the pain that had been carefully suppressed for generations. Ethan, taken to the police station for observation, stared at the diary with eerie calm. Unlike the adults, who trembled at these revelations, the boy seemed to already know every detail. He pointed to a passage where Samuel described voices echoing from the bottom of the well and said, "They never stopped calling. It's just that no one wanted to listen." The boys. Words sounded like confirmation of everything. The police, pressured by the community, organized more intensive searches, but each step toward the truth revealed more resistance from higher authorities. Documents mysteriously disappeared, files were declared lost, and rumors of bribery began to circulate. It was as if the town had been divided between those who wanted justice and those who still fought to protect a convenient silence. The diary, however, was undeniable. Evidence that Salem Heights had a past stained by unspeakable crimes was there for all to see. With each line, more than a dark story unfolded. It was a blood pact that now came back to exact its price. And at the heart of this revelation, a certainty began to form. What Ethan sensed wasn't just memory or intuition. There was something alive, still trapped at the bottom of that well, waiting to be discovered. And the next step, inevitable and terrifying, would be to face what was really inside. Because if until now they had found only papers and mementos, what would emerge when they touched the darkness with their own hands? The diary's revelation fell upon Salem Heights like an unstoppable bombshell. Suddenly, every respectable face in town was under suspicion. The names depicted in the old pages mingled with surnames that still carried power, wealth, and influence. It was as if the past had reached across the decades to sit at the community table, demanding that each person face the weight of their inheritance. The families of the alleged victims demanded that the search continue. However, while one group clamored for justice, another did everything possible to hush up the case. Local politicians, business people, and even religious figures pressured the police to close the investigation, citing a lack of material evidence. The misplaced files and missing documents only heightened the feeling that someone, somewhere, was still pulling the strings to keep the silence. Sergeant Miller, torn between loyalty to the community and the weight of truth, found his authority questioned. Many accused him of negligence for not taking Ethan's signals seriously from the start. Others, however, saw him as the only one capable of standing up to the pressure of those in power. Amidst this, Miller began receiving anonymous threats, letters left on his doorstep, phone calls in the dead of night, all with the same message: leave the past where it is. Despite the climate of fear, an excavation team was sent to the well. But to everyone's surprise, the operation was abruptly halted. Senior officials cited structural risks and suspended the search indefinitely. The news outraged the population, which began to gather in protests outside City Hall. For the first time, Salem Heights was divided into two: those who wanted to bury the truth once again, and those willing to pay any price to expose it. Meanwhile, Ethan remained restless. His screams had diminished, but not from relief. There was a strange, almost painful calm about him, as if he knew the town wouldn't have the courage to go through with it. At night, he told his mother that the echoes were getting louder, and that soon he wouldn't be the only one hearing them. The feeling of impunity gnawed at the common residents, but the idea of full justice seemed unattainable. Even so, the diary had planted a seed that would be impossible to uproot. Everyone now knew that the darkness of the well wasn't just metaphorical, it was literal. Something or someone had been buried there, and the entire town carried the guilt of refusing to face the truth. And, as if fate wanted to punish this collective hesitation, new manifestations began to occur around the well. The unbearable smell grew stronger each day. Clearer sounds echoed from the depths, and some residents claimed to have seen figures moving nearby at night. Salem Heights was being reminded, against its will, that silence would never be enough to erase the past. And faced with this scenario of uncertainty, one inevitable question remained. How far was the town willing to go to keep its secrets? The answer would come not just in the form of documents or investigations, but in something that would forever mark the life of Ethan and all who dared remain near the well. The following days were filled with heavy silence in Salem Heights. The town, once marked by lively conversations in cafes and children running free in the streets, now seemed suffocated by an invisible fear. The well remained untouched, guarded by police tape that meant little in the face of the growing mystery. And at the center of this maelstrom was Ethan, the boy no one could ignore. He no longer screamed as he had before. His body looked tired, as if the energy drained during all those episodes had finally taken its toll. But there was something different in his gaze. If before it had been filled with terror, now it conveyed a strange serenity, almost too mature for his age. It was as if the boy had understood something adults dared not admit. One grey morning, Ethan walked alone to the park. His mother followed at a distance, fearful that another crisis might occur, but to her surprise, he seemed calm. He approached the well, slowly, unhurriedly, and stood at its edge for several long minutes. He didn't say a word, just took a deep breath, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Then, in an unexpected move, he bent down, picked up a small stone from the ground, and carefully placed it on the moss-covered ledge. The simple, almost ritualistic gesture seemed to carry profound symbolic weight. It was as if Ethan were marking an end, or perhaps sealing a silent pact with whatever remained below. Some people watching from a distance reported that the instant the stone touched the well, a cold breeze swept through the square, accompanied by a faint echo, like a whisper coming from the depths. No one could explain it, but everyone felt it. Ethan then took a step back. His face no longer held terror, but an enigmatic calm that made the adults even more uncomfortable. Before turning to leave, he murmured firmly, "Now they know." These 3 words spread quickly throughout the city, repeated in whispers, engraved in the memory of those present. In the following days, the boy avoided talking about the well. He returned to his school routine, still isolated from his classmates, but without the outbursts of before. The town, however, could not return to normal. Ethan's gesture became an almost sacred scene, interpreted in different ways. Some saw it as a sign that the spirits were finally at peace. Others believed it was just the beginning of something even darker. The truth is, no one was sure. What everyone knew was that after that act, Salem Heights would never be the same again. The well remained there, silent, as it always had been, but now it bore the mark of a secret revealed and at the same time unfinished. And faced with this mystery that hung over everyone, all that remained was the gaze of a boy who somehow seemed to have fulfilled his role. Salem Heights would never be the same after what happened. The well, which for decades had been just a forgotten stone in the middle of Central Park, was now remembered as the guardian of a secret that should never have been buried. No matter how much police tape the city put around it, no matter how many times the newspapers tried to soften the story, everyone knew that this place held something that defied silence and logic. Ethan, the boy who screamed when no one else dared, became an unwitting symbol of an inconvenient truth. He no longer needed to despair before the well, because the town had already understood. His eyes no longer reflected just the fear of a child, but the silent strength of someone who fulfilled a role no adult had the courage to assume. He screamed for all those who could no longer scream. He pointed to the abyss everyone pretended not to see. The last words he said, "Now they know," echoed like a sentence. It wasn't just the declaration of an exhausted boy, but confirmation that the secret was no longer hidden. From that moment on, no one could plead ignorance. The city, once proud of its peace, would forever be shadowed by a past that was never justice, but silence. And that's what makes this story so disturbing. Ethan's screams weren't just a reflection of trauma. They were a reminder that some truths, no matter how painful, find a way to emerge, even if we try to suppress them, even if they're buried under layers of lies and decades of oblivion, they always return. The well remains there, silent but not empty. It holds not only the bodies and memories of the past, but also the reminder that fear and truth walk side by side. And you, who followed every detail so far, now know it too. The question remains, what would you do if it were your town, your family, your buried secret? How far would you go to keep silent? And how far would you have the courage to scream like Ethan? Subscribe to the channel now, activate the bell, and share this video. Stories like this cannot be forgotten because silence can sometimes be more frightening than the truth itself.